I told him we lost the baby to stop the questions. Not because I had no answers, because the real answers would have ended everything on the spot, and I was not ready for that yet. I told myself I was buying time. I told myself I had a plan. I told myself I was protecting both of us from a truth that neither of us was prepared for, and that I would find the right moment and the right words before anything became permanent. What I did not account for was the clinic's automated appointment system, which does not know anything about what a marriage can and cannot survive, and which emailed my husband on a Tuesday evening to confirm my upcoming prenatal scan. My name is Nadia. I am 31 years old. I work as a graphic designer, and for most of my adult life, I have understood myself to be someone who handles things. Not someone who falls apart and asks for help. Not someone who lets situations develop past the point where they can be managed. Someone who sees what is coming, makes a plan, and executes it cleanly before anyone else has to know there was ever a problem to begin with. My mother called this quality in herself strength, and I inherited the word, along with everything that had produced it in her. Marek and I had been married for 3 years when I stood at the doorway of the second bedroom and made myself look at the box on the floor. The room smelled of dried primer because we had started painting it in the early weeks, when the pregnancy was still news we were telling each other was good, and then we stopped, and the primer smell had nowhere to go. My mother started knitting a small cream-coloured blanket the day I called to tell her I was pregnant and mailed it with a note that read, "For whoever this turns out to be." When I told Marek we had lost the baby 11 days ago, I moved the blanket into a cardboard box and put the box in that room and closed the door. He was treating me with the specific careful gentleness of a man who does not know how to help but is trying his best anyway. That Sunday morning, he made 2 separate cups of coffee without thinking. We had always shared one mug, passing it back and forth over the crossword from the same corner vendor on Mokotowska, a ritual neither of us formally decided on, and both of us had maintained for 3 years without interruption. He set 2 cups on the table and looked at them, and understood the mistake and looked at me, and I said it was fine. He asked that evening, carefully, whether I wanted to speak to someone, and I told him I was managing, and he accepted that answer because accepting it was easier than what came next, and Marek has always organised his energy around what is most productive. I walked back down the hallway and stopped at the second bedroom door and stood at the threshold between what I had said and what was actually happening inside my body. And then I moved on. The clinic's email arrived on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner, and Marek was in his home office with the door half open, and I heard his chair move, and then heard the specific silence of a person who has stopped what they were doing and has not started anything else. He came into the kitchen holding his phone in one hand, and his expression was the stillness of someone who has read something twice to make sure they read it correctly. He read the subject line aloud. The sender was St. Anne's private clinic in Krowodrza. The recipient was his registered contact address. The subject confirmed my upcoming prenatal scan for the following Thursday at 10:15 in the morning. He read the appointment type. He read the date. He did not raise his voice or lower it. He read the information the way someone reads a document they want to be absolutely certain they understand before they say anything about it. And then he looked at me across the kitchen counter and waited. I said the situation had been complicated, that there had been a scare, that I had understood the pregnancy to have ended, and was then told at a follow-up that it had in fact continued, that I hadn't wanted to raise his hopes again before I was certain things were stable. I delivered this with the steadiness I have learned to use when presenting difficult information, paced carefully, with the appropriate amount of visible uncertainty, leaving enough space for the listener to process rather than react. I had been composing this explanation for days against exactly this possibility, and I watched his face while I said it, measuring the gap between what I was offering and what he was receiving. He stood at the kitchen counter and asked me whether the Thursday appointment was a standard prenatal scan, not a post-loss monitoring visit, not a complication follow-up, but an ordinary prenatal appointment for a continuing pregnancy. He referenced the specific phrasing from the subject line. He asked me to confirm that one thing before anything else was discussed, and he said it in the tone of a person making a reasonable request who already understands it will not be simple. His thumb still resting on the open email, as if he had decided the document needed to remain visible until the conversation caught up to it. I told him he always needed everything sorted into a clean category and that not everything worked that way, and that I had been managing a medical situation and handled it as best I could, and I didn't need him to process it through the system that made most sense to his organizing brain. I said it was nothing in a tone I directed at his reaction, rather than at the situation itself, as though his stillness were the problem in the room. He set the phone face down on the counter and told me he was not angry yet, and he said yet very quietly, which was more honest than anything theatrical would have been. He said that if I told him what had actually happened, the full version, not the managed one, he believed they could figure it out together, and he offered this in the only shape his love reliably took: a practical framework, evidence he was already thinking about the future, a belief that problems have solutions when you bring the right information to them. It was the best thing he had, and I did not take it. That night, I lay in bed building the next version of events: how to explain the continuation of the pregnancy in a way that did not require naming the fact that could not yet be named. 2 mornings after the email, Marek sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface in a posture I had never seen him use before, the posture of someone who needs to feel the solid thing beneath them, and asked whether the baby was his. He did not accuse me. He asked with the precision of someone for whom accuracy is the only thing, and the pause before I answered was long enough to carry information on its own. I said of course it was. I said it steadily. He said he would like to come to the Thursday appointment. I told him it had been rescheduled, and it had not been rescheduled, and I rescheduled it the following morning. 2 days later, I met Petra at Café Lemon on Duga Street, the narrow cafe with wooden chairs and a window that fogged in cold weather and the particular privacy of a place you went to so often the staff had stopped paying attention to you. I told her about the email and the kitchen conversation and the question he had asked at the table. She listened without saying anything. Then she said she thought Marek deserved to know the actual truth, not a suggestion but a statement delivered with the quiet firmness of someone who has been thinking about it for longer than this particular conversation. She said she had been thinking about it for weeks and was not going to keep pretending she wasn't. I told her she didn't understand what the truth would do, and she looked at the table and said quietly that she thought I might mean what the truth would do to me, specifically. The distinction was so precise that I had nothing to add to it, so I paid for my coffee and left, and we did not speak for 8 days. That evening, Marek came out of his office and set a sheet of paper on the kitchen table without announcement and went back to his office. From where I was standing, I could read the first line, one of 6 questions, numbered in his neat, regular handwriting. The question asked who the father of the baby was. He had already asked this at the table, but putting it in writing meant it existed somewhere outside the conversation, outside my ability to redirect or absorb. And the 5 remaining questions were visible below it, in the same controlled hand. The dinner party on Mokotowska Street had been scheduled for weeks before the email, and I told myself that cancelling would require more explanation than attending, which was true, and that attending would allow me to re-establish the social version of events on my own terms, which was also true, and that both of these reasons made attendance the correct decision, which is where the reasoning became less reliable than I was willing to examine at the time. Marek chose not to cancel either. We arrived together and navigated the hallway greetings and coat removal and all the small social rituals of people who still live in the same apartment and have agreed, without discussing it, to perform normalcy in front of people who have known them for years. There were 8 of us at the long table with its mismatched chairs, 2 bottles of wine already open, the dinner smelling of rosemary and roasted garlic from something Ewa had been preparing since the afternoon. I scanned the room as I always do in social situations I need to navigate, identifying who knows which version of events, from whom, and with what level of detail. 3 people at the table had heard the miscarriage story from me directly, in the version I composed at the time. One person, Tomek, a colleague of Marek's who had also been invited through the overlapping circle of their 2 families, had been on the same infrastructure project as Marek for the past 4 months and knew his schedule with the precision of someone who shared a site office with him. I noted this and did not change my plan. The conversation arrived at the pregnancy mid-evening, with the gentle, predictable momentum of gatherings at the point when the second bottle is half empty. Someone asked how I was feeling. I said I had been carrying a lot on my own through the difficult weeks. Someone said they hadn't realized. Had Marek not been able to take time off? I said he had been very focused on the current project, and I delivered this without sharpness, which was precisely what gave it its edge. I said I had learned to manage things independently, and I said it with the small, self-aware smile that positioned it as personal resilience rather than complaint. And it was the most carefully constructed sentence I delivered all evening, and I presented it as though it had occurred to me naturally. 3 people at the table looked at Marek. He was looking at his plate. He did not respond, and his silence in that room, among those particular people, read exactly as I had understood it would read. Iwa asked him how he was holding up through everything, and he said he was fine, using the flat specific register of a person who has decided that fine is the only available answer for the next several hours. I watched him say it from across the table and read his restraint as processing, as evidence that he was adjusting, accepting, moving toward the version of events I was presenting. And I would understand later, much later, that I had made a fundamental error in reading his stillness as movement. Tomek made his remark about an hour into the meal in the specific measured tone of a man placing something into the record. He said he had heard it had been a difficult few weeks and wanted Marek to know he hadn't forgotten that Marek had taken 3 days off during that period, and that he thought it was important Marek knew that had been noticed by the people who were paying attention. He said it without looking at me. The table heard it, and Marek said thank you in the same quiet register he had been using all evening, and the damage was clean and surgical and entirely outside my reach. A direct witnessed contradiction of the narrative I had been building for weeks, delivered by a credible source to exactly the audience that mattered. And there was nothing I could introduce into it without making it worse. In the taxi home, Marek did not speak, and it was a different silence than his other silences. Not the silence of someone gathering himself or deciding how to begin, but the silence of someone who has finished deciding and is simply allowing the decision to settle. I tried to open a conversation, and he said, very quietly, that he had heard everything I said at the table, and then added nothing further. The taxi moved through the dark streets, and I told myself his quiet was a form of guilt, that he understood he had been genuinely absent in some way and was processing it. And I maintained this interpretation for the length of the ride because I needed it to be true, and I was still very capable of needing things to be true. Then, in the dark between 2 streetlights, my hand moved to my abdomen. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and I moved my hand away and looked out the window, and my face was completely still. And I did not think about it again until much later, when I understood it had not been invisible to everyone in the car. When we got home, Marek went directly to his office and closed the door, and I heard his voice through the door, low, continuous, the sound of someone speaking at length to a specific person about a specific matter. I stood in the hallway and tried to make out words and could not. I stood there longer than I should have. In the morning, his desk calendar had 2 new dates marked in his handwriting, each with a brief notation beside it, an initial, a time, an abbreviation that was not part of his project shorthand, which I knew because I had read his project calendar for 3 years when we were coordinating schedules. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation and began composing what it might be. The drive to Nowy Sącz took 2 hours, and we spent most of it in the silence that had become the default register of our shared space. Not hostile, just depleted. The quiet of two people who have said too many partial things and are running low on energy for any more. Marek's parents' house was warm and full of people when we arrived. The particular busy warmth of a family that fills a house with noise because silence is considered something to be managed collectively, and I had navigated this gathering before and understood its geography. The version of events that had circulated here was the one I had composed in the early weeks. The pregnancy announced, the difficult months, the complication that had seemed like a loss and turned out not to be. And several people expressed their relief briefly and warmly before the gathering's other demands absorbed them. I received each expression with the appropriate calibration of grateful fragility and moved on with them. Hannah found me in the kitchen mid-afternoon during a brief interval when we were alone, and she had been watching the morning with the patient attention of someone waiting for an appointment. She said she was glad the pregnancy had continued, and she said it while looking directly at me, without the social warmth that surrounded every other exchange in the house. The sentence was structurally kind and communicated something else entirely, the specific attention of someone who has been watching something develop and wants you to know they have not been watching casually. I said thank you. She nodded and went back to the table. Nothing explicit had passed between us, and the communication had been entirely precise. My mother was there as an old friend of Marek's mother, and Renata is warm at gatherings, competent at surfaces, a person who manages the visible shape of social situations with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing it for decades. Before dessert, she found a moment near the window with me and said she wanted to know how I was really doing, and I said I was managing, and she said she had managed for 17 years and it was exhausting and she would not recommend it. She said very gently that whatever I was doing to hold things together was going to become harder when the baby arrived, not easier. I changed the subject, and she let me change it without looking surprised. That was the most honest observation anyone had offered me in months, and I did not examine it carefully because examining it carefully would have required me to see what it reflected, and I was not yet able to look at that directly. That night back in Krakow, Marek sat on the edge of the bed while I was in the bathroom, and when I came back out, he was still sitting there, not looking at his phone, not looking at anything, just sitting in the specific stillness of someone who has encountered their own sadness in an unguarded moment. I asked if he was all right. He said he kept thinking about the notes he used to fold into the pockets of my coats before I travelled, the ones with train platform numbers and hotel extension numbers and reminders to eat before boarding. He said he had found one still in the inside pocket of my winter coat from the Warsaw trip 18 months ago, that I had never taken it out. He said he didn't know why he was telling me this, and he said it with genuine confusion, as though he had expected by now to have moved past it. For a real unguarded moment, I almost said something true, and the true thing contained Dominic's name. And when I measured what followed that name, I closed the opening before it finished opening. I told him I remembered the note, that I kept it because I liked his handwriting. He nodded. He turned off the light. I spent the next day composing the partial truth, the version that admitted a mistake during a period of real distance, that acknowledged I had handled it alone and was sorry. That did not name Dominic. I called Petra and asked to meet at Café Lemon, and she was already there when I arrived, and I laid out the plan, the partial truth, how to frame it, how to lead with the specific limitation in the marriage as context. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said she was not going to help me tell a smaller lie to cover a larger one. She said it without anger, which made it harder to argue with than anger would have been. She said she had been feeling sick about everything for weeks, and she was sorry but she could not continue. I told her the partial truth protected everyone. She looked at her coffee and said she thought I might want to examine very carefully who it actually protected. I paid and left. The tactic was dead before it was deployed. 2 days after the Noe Sonch gathering, I walked past Marek's home office and looked at his desk through the open doorway, and under the desk lamp was a small folded card with a name I did not recognize, a phone number, and the word attorney written clearly beneath in his handwriting. He had not mentioned consulting anyone. He had placed the card where I passed every day, at a height where it was impossible to miss if you were looking at the desk at all. I told myself it was related to a property matter on one of his infrastructure contracts, and maintained this explanation for 48 hours before I stopped being able to maintain it. Petra called on a Wednesday evening, and her voice was different, not guilty but resolved, which was worse than guilty. She said Marek had called her that morning and asked 2 questions, and she had answered them, and she was sorry but she could not continue covering for something she had known the full truth about from the beginning. I asked what she had told him. She said that the baby was Dominic's. Then she said goodnight, and the line went quiet. I came home from a client meeting to an apartment that had been cleaned with the thoroughness of someone who needed to do something with their hands while they made a decision with their mind. Every surface ordered, the kitchen spotless, the particular organized stillness of a space that has been prepared for something. Marek was in his office with the door open and was not working, and he was waiting in the manner of a person who has decided to let the other person enter the room first. I did not let him speak first. I sat across from him and delivered the managed confession, the most complete version I had been composing for weeks, layered and sequenced so that each piece supported the piece before it, structured so the full shape of it read as honesty rather than as what it actually was. I said the pregnancy had occurred during a period of real distance between us, that I had made a mistake with someone I used to know, that it had not been planned, that I had handled it alone because I believed that was the right thing to do for the marriage while I found the timing and the words for a fuller truth. I said the miscarriage story had been meant to protect him. I said I was sorry. I delivered it steadily, with the specific vulnerability of someone who has rehearsed vulnerability until it presents as genuine, and I believed, as I said it, that I was finally being honest, which is the most precise description of my blind spot in the entire story. He listened without moving. When I finished, he asked one question: whether there had been a single moment in the past 4 months when I had intended to tell him the truth without something external forcing the conversation. The question stayed in the room. I moved to what I had instead. I said he had sat with a written list of 6 questions for days rather than simply talking to me, and that his inability to exist in the relationship without organizing it into a document first was part of the distance that had made everything else possible. I said his way of loving, the insurance questions, the savings projections, the backup plans for contingencies that had not yet materialized, had left me living inside a future that was entirely planned and entirely without him present in it. I said this was not entirely my fault. Some of this was true, and the parts that were true made the parts that were justification harder to separate out cleanly, and I used the accuracy of the real grievance to carry the weight of the excuse alongside it. He heard the difference between what was accurate and what was being made to carry more than it could hold, and I could see that he heard it in the way his expressions settled into something quieter and more final than grief. He told me he wanted to be honest in return, that he could not continue living in a marriage where he had no reliable way of knowing what was real. He said it was not a threat and not a performance, but the most accurate description of what he needed that he was capable of giving. Then he said that if I could tell him right now, not manage it, not frame it, just tell him, whether there was a version of this they could rebuild together, he would call the attorney about something other than what he was currently planning. He said it simply, with no pressure around it, and it was the most direct he had been with me in years. And it was the last time he was going to offer his framework as a form of repair. I told him his inability to simply sit with me, to be present without a structure, without a list, without the next step already organized, was exactly the problem he had never been willing to look at directly. And I said the marriage had become something I could not breathe inside, and I said this was not entirely my fault. These things were not entirely wrong. The way I was using them was not honest, and he heard that too. He said very quietly that he was going to handle things properly. Not as a threat aimed at producing a reaction, but as a statement made because silence would have been its own kind of untruth. And then he picked up his phone and went to his office, and the door closed softly, and the softness of it was more precise than any other communication in the room. I sat in the living room in the cleaned apartment, and the composition I had spent weeks building had produced nothing I could use. The management had not managed anything. I was in the same apartment, looking at the same walls, and the sense of control I had felt while preparing the confession was simply absent, the way a light is absent when the switch does nothing. For the first time since the clinic's email, I did not immediately begin planning the next move. I sat with the absence and did not name it, but I stayed with it long enough that it had a shape. 3 mornings later, before anything was said aloud, a banking notification arrived on my phone while I was standing at the kitchen counter. A transfer from the joint savings account to an individual account in his name. The exact amount of the emergency fund he had built in their second year of marriage as protection against futures he could not predict. He had not touched the joint checking. He had not moved anything else. He had moved precisely the one thing he had created specifically for unpredictable circumstances. And it was not punishment, and it was not cruelty. It was the first step in a sequence that had a second and a third and an end I had no frame for. And I understood standing there that the sequence had been underway for longer than this particular morning. The mediation centre on Starowischlna Street had beige walls and a table designed to belong to no one. Marek's attorney was present. I had not retained my own, which the attorney noted without judgment. On the table was a dissolution petition with 2 attachments: a formal court-ordered DNA testing request and a temporary financial order separating assets while proceedings remained active. Dominic's full legal name appeared in the document in the same typeface as everything else, unframed without context, belonging to the record rather than to my version of events. The family court appointment for the initial paternity hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks from that morning, with the DNA lab appointment to follow. The attorney explained that paternity determination was a prerequisite for any custody and support framework, and that the 2 proceedings were linked from the outset as a matter of standard process. He explained it as though it was self-evident, because it was. I said I wanted to have an honest conversation about what had happened, and that I was committed to cooperating fully and transparently. I used the word honest with complete sincerity. The attorney said that cooperation in the legal sense had a specific definition, and that all parties would benefit from consulting their own representatives before the next session. And he recommended I retain counsel before then. And the conversation moved forward without my version of events having any effect on the shape of the table or the documents on it. Outside on the pavement of Starowischlna Street, Hannah was standing by Marek's car because she had driven him, and she was the kind of person who shows up for that reason without needing the request explained twice. I went over to her and said this was not what I had wanted. She said she knew, and then she said she thought everyone involved in this could probably say that, and she said it without cruelty or satisfaction, as a simple observation about a situation that had produced no winners, and she looked at me with the expression of someone who has decided not to say everything they know, which was its own quiet form of decency. I went back to the apartment that afternoon while Marek was at a site visit in Katowice. I walked down the hallway. I stopped at the second bedroom door. I opened it. The box was still on the floor, the primer smell fainter now. Months of closed air had softened it towards something almost ordinary. I looked at the box. I closed the door. I left it there. Closure snapshot. She had believed she was the person who kept things from falling apart, and she managed herself out of every room that mattered. Petra's guest room has a folding daybed and borrowed sheets, and a window that faces a courtyard where nothing much happens. The joint accounts are frozen under the temporary order. Dominic received his copy of the court documents and said he needed to speak to a lawyer and did not ask how she was feeling, and the line was quiet for 30 seconds before she said goodbye and hung up. The DNA appointment is 6 weeks from the mediation date. A client referred through Marek's professional network sent a professionally worded note about pausing the project indefinitely, and the timing was not accidental. The social circle has contracted in the specific way of people who cannot determine which version of events is accurate and have decided to wait at a careful distance until it becomes clearer. She had a plan, and the plan was always about buying time, and the time ran out the way time does. Not at once, but in small documented increments, each one logged somewhere she did not think to check. The blanket is still in the box, in a room that belongs to someone else now, and she left it there because she still cannot decide what that means about her, and deciding was never what she was best at anyway.